Hundreds of Africans from Ebola-plagued countries are being set loose on American soil. Should you be worried? We'll go into it on this episode of The Hot Zone.
This is The Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hey folks, Chuck Holton here. On the U.S. southern border, the Border Patrol is still seeing the numbers of illegal crossers just off the charts. Two very large groups were apprehended in separate incidents over the course of the last week. On June 4th in El Paso, agents responded to a large group of illegal aliens crossing the Rio Grande just west of downtown. And that's where they've been working on the fence. As responding agents arrived, the amount of illegal aliens increased, and they ended up apprehending a total of 268 illegal crossers. In a separate incident, June 5th, agents from the Lordsburg region caught a group of 258 illegal aliens out near Antelope Wells in the remote New Mexico boot heel. Now, both large groups were comprised of primarily family units and unaccompanied children from Guatemala and Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. But we're also seeing a spike in what they call exotics. That is, crossers from countries around the world, especially Africa and the Middle East and Asia. So just to give you a sense of what these agents have to face with these huge groups of people, also on June 5th, there was an agent in the El Paso station who was performing roll call in a camp for all these migrants when she was threatened and assaulted by a Cuban migrant under her care. The woman had to be restrained by other agents. Last week, the Border Patrol apprehended at least 3 convicted sex offenders who had all served jail time in the United States and then had later been deported. Well, now they're back, infiltrating in along with the crush of humanity that's surging across the border. Also last week, El Paso Border Patrol agents conducted 2 water rescues in 2 separate incidents where migrants were trying to cross the Rio Grande and started to drown. These agents had to put themselves at risk, put their lives on the line to save these illegal crossers. Well, Monday, the Border Patrol bust over 300 African migrants into San Antonio and then set them loose. Hundreds more are to follow, reportedly. These are men and women from Congo, Cameroon, and other West African countries, many of whom are beset by problems much worse than the war on poverty. The biggest problem in those countries right now, I would say, is the spread of Ebola. Let me tell you, that's one nasty virus, and it's something all of us need to keep an eye on. None of us were alive back in 1919 when the Spanish flu killed almost 100 million people around the globe, one of whom was my great-grandmother. But Ebola is the kind of virus that could cause a pandemic like that, especially with the ease of air travel around the world today. So a few months ago, I got a chance to interview one of the world's foremost experts on Ebola, a scientist named Ellen Jo Barrett. Check out this excerpt of our conversation. Well, the other day I would just so happen to meet one of the foremost experts on Ebola on the planet, a microbiologist who has been instrumental in developing a vaccine for Ebola, which has been used on more than 60,000 people already in the Congo last year in an attempt to stop the transmission of the virus.
I'm Ellen Jo Barrett. PhD, diplomat of the American College of Microbiology, Professor Emerita of Pathology and Microbiology, Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. And I have been working with Ebola in my second job as Executive Director of Medical Affairs for Cepheid, the world's second largest molecular diagnostics company. Ebola is a virus that once it gains entry into your tissues and into your bloodstream, it will multiply very quickly and it will break down all the linings of your capillaries and allow blood to seep into all your tissues and all the liquids that you discharge. So since the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract, becomes leaky, blood will go into the GI tract, and when you defecate, it will be full of blood. Your eyes will begin to bleed, your nose will bleed, your saliva will be tinged with blood because your capillaries are no longer able to maintain the blood within the tubes. And so Eventually, the virus breaks down the entire tissue of your body and you die. You catch it by coming into contact with secretions from an infected patient. And it can't penetrate intact skin. So it has to penetrate either through your eyes, your nose, your mouth, or through a cut. The mortality of an infection is anywhere from 50% to 80 or 90%, depending on the supportive care you get. Although there are some treatments in clinical trials in the Congo, where the ongoing outbreak is, there is no known cure for Ebola virus infection. You can't catch it by casual contact, but there is a potential for airborne transmission. So actually, if someone sneezed on the bus and you breathed in that sneeze particles fairly quickly, you could contract Ebola from that.
So what's the biggest fear that the CDC has about Ebola?
I think the biggest fear is the panic that would be engendered in the population if there were some Ebola cases detected in the United States. When patients come back from the Ebola zone, they're placed in the strictest type of quarantine possible just to prevent additional cases from occurring. But only healthcare workers or people who come in direct contact with those patients would be at risk. It's very hard to weaponize Ebola to infect a lot of people at one time easily, because the virus will live in blood for up to 3 weeks, for example. So if you had large quantities of infected blood and you blew those tubes of blood up in a crowd, everybody who got hit by a piece of glass would become infected by Ebola, but that would be several hundred people at most. You can't put it into the air and disseminate it into a stadium like you could anthrax spores. If you contrast Bacillus anthracis and Ebola virus as pathogens for bioterrorism purposes, anthrax is a much more reasonable risk because you can weaponize the spores. They will live in the environment for years, dried. You can grow it in culture easily, so you could grow billions and billions of them, put them in some sort of bomb, wait until the right moment, and then disperse them widely. Whereas Ebola, the most time it will live is 3 or 4 weeks, and it must be in protein or in blood. You can't dry it out and then disseminate it. So you would have a much smaller group of people that you could infect at one time. So anthrax is a bacterium that grows very quickly, and it makes an environmentally strong, resistant spore form that can exist in the soil or on a dry surface for years, waiting for the proper environment to then regerminate and become a bacillus. And anthrax is weaponizable because of those spores. We've already seen in 2001 a huge national panic attack when only 3 or 4 people actually became infected with anthrax when it was sent through the mail in spores. But everyone else thought they were at risk, and other people became very excited. It was easily cured, and you can disinfect a building using hydrogen peroxide vapor, for example, easily. But nevertheless, large numbers of people could be infected by weaponized spores. Whereas Ebola, you could infect 100 people at once, but not much more than that. And then each individual additional case would be a person-to-person contact. When in Africa, there are a number of cultural norms, such as how to manage a dead body and bury the body. And so family members want hands-on the body. They want to be able to bathe the body, clothe the body. It's hard to get those people to change that behavior until the test has been performed to rule out Ebola. So the biggest number of people who catch it in those pandemic areas are family members who are handling the secretions from the patient while they're sick, caregivers such as laboratory workers and physicians and nurses, and then the family members as well. So it passes person to person on hands and secretions. So travelers to Africa should avoid Ebola pandemic areas, but in general, those are not the areas where travelers would be going anyway. And one should always wash one's hands when you're traveling often, and avoids secretions from other people, even including sexual transmission. Don't have sex with Africans during an Ebola outbreak.
Good advice from an expert there. I'll keep that in mind. All right, so Ebola, very bad. Does that mean we need to worry about Africans who are entering our country that hail from those regions? Well, probably not as much as you might think. Since the path these guys take to get here usually takes them from Africa to Ecuador, then they ride up on buses or walk through the Darien Gap and then continue their journey on up through Central America for weeks or months before reaching our border. Most of them have been on the road already for so long, sometimes up to a year. So if they were infected with Ebola, they'd be dead already. But you could say one effect of this infrastructure of support, let's say, that's been created throughout Latin America to help these migrants reach the United States could get blamed if Ebola ends up jumping the Atlantic and breaking out here in the Western Hemisphere. And this virus is so nasty, that's a real issue that should be being talked about on all the major networks. But I went online this morning and looked around and could literally find zero about any of this on any of the mainstream media's websites on their main pages. So it's left to kooky websites like InfoWars to bring the issue up, which I believe is those guys sort of overstated the risk for America and for the reasons that I've already stated. So why is this seemingly half of Africa trying to leave right now? Is it Ebola or something else? When I was reporting from the Darien Gap here in Panama a month ago, there were lots and lots of Cameroonians coming out of the jungle. Now, Cameroon is one of the world's most underreported displacement crises. Right now, according to the international humanitarian aid community, that West African country ranks as one of the worst refugee crises in the world. That is, over 500,000 people have been pushed out of their homes already in the wake of fighting that's been going on there. And we're going to take a look today at the causes of that fighting and how that's affecting the flow of refugees, many of whom, as I said, are coming to the United States. Now, there's a guy named Jan Egeland, who's a Norwegian diplomat, political scientist, humanitarian leader, and currently the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. He recently went to Cameroon to see what's causing so many of its people to pack up and leave.
I'm now in Buea. It is in the southwestern Cameroon, where there is a forgotten and neglected war, a forgotten and neglected emergency. 500,000 people has been displaced in southwestern and northwestern Cameroon. Very many people to Buea, where I am now, including these ladies behind me, who saw their villages being torched and now are living either out in the open here or with relatives in town. NRC has given them some support, but it is limited. There are very few humanitarian agencies. There is very little humanitarian assistance to these people. This war is not at all in the international media. And the message that they gave me now as I will be returning to Europe is the following. We were colonized by 3 European powers, they say. First Germany, and after that divided between France and Great Britain. And now the Francophone and the Anglophone regions is the cause of lots of the tension and an uprising met by harsh military response that displace people. So Europe, the rest of the world, wake up to this emergency. Help us, they say. We are not getting enough relief. And first and foremost, there is far too little pressure on the armed actors to sit down, grown men, to settle this. At the moment, there is 1 million kids out of school now because no schools are operating because of the conflict. Grown men must talk together so that women and their children do not suffer.
So in this case, it's violence between French speakers and English speakers. In Nigeria, it's violence between Muslims and Christians, or Boko Haram and everybody else. In Congo, there's violence between militia groups. ISIS is in there, and the people are just so ignorant and superstitious that they keep killing the doctors and aid workers who are trying to stop the very spread of Ebola. So if you're getting the sense that Africa is a pretty violent place, you'd be right. Unfortunately, though, it's not politically correct to bring it up. What we see there is that when people are raised in this kind of culture and then they migrate to the Western world, they very often bring that kind of violence along with them just because they don't know any different. Even though it's ostensibly what they're fleeing from, they just can't help it. That's the only way they know. We've seen it a lot in Europe, especially. A couple of years ago, I went to Sweden and reported on this. Check out what I made there.
I've never been anywhere where it was so appropriate to wear a burqa because it's just so cold. It might keep your ears from falling off. Anyhow, when it comes to Donald Trump and what he had to say in his speech a couple of weeks ago, of course, we all know that only a day or two after that speech, there were riots in Rinkeby, right where I'm standing, actually in this square, and in the parking lot outside, they burned a half a dozen cars. Now, with the temperature being what it is, maybe they were just trying to stay warm. I don't know. But nevertheless, we did see some serious rioting in this neighborhood. Now, I want to say something. Donald Trump mentioned that, there's stuff going on in Sweden and that it's bad. And the media jumped on that and went crazy. Even the Swedish government jumped on it and said that's completely false. And in a way, it is false. And now Donald Trump was referencing a Fox News report that talked about the rise of sexual assaults and other kinds of crime in Sweden. And in truth, those kinds of crimes have gone up over the last few years. Although, here's the real story. The Swedish government has not been measuring any kind of crime against immigration or immigrant statistics. So they haven't been measuring where people were born, these criminals, since 2001. And that's really the question. Why don't they want to know, or at least why don't they want their people to know where these criminals come from?
Chuck,
now, go ahead.
I was just going to say, that's really it, isn't it? It's one thing to have these crimes going on. It's another thing for the people of their country to be told that they're not happening by the media, to be told that the police are not going to list the ethnicity of anybody. And at the same time, they're saying things like, you got to be careful. Maybe you shouldn't wear a miniskirt outside. Do you think that the Swedish people, the residents, the native Swedish people, have basically had enough of this? Do you think that they're starting to turn the corner? And do you think they might eventually get rid of this ridiculous government the way they did in Britain and threatening to do in France as well?
Well, they certainly have reasonable cause to do so. Just in the last week or so, there have been 3 bombings here in Sweden. Now, Sweden also has very draconian gun laws like France does. And there have been 1 car bomb and 2 grenade attacks over the last several days. So if the Swedes needed a reason to vote out this government, or to at least demand that they start publishing these statistics, I think that they have reason to do so.
So the conflict has so far uprooted 500,000 people in southwest and northwest Cameroon. Hundreds of villages have been set ablaze. Hospitals have been attacked. Health workers are being abducted or killed. Over 780,000 children aren't going to school now, and thousands of people are having to literally go out and hide in the bushes, and they're getting no humanitarian relief whatsoever. So I'm planning a trip now. I'm in the planning stages to go to Africa next month to do some more investigating on this and a whole lot of other issues. And let me tell you, getting a visa to enter these countries is an absolutely soul-crushing process. So I called the Nigerian embassy to go, what is going on with this, man? And the ambassador's office talked to me and were very blunt about it, that the reason that they make it so difficult for you to get a visa to Nigeria is simply because it's difficult to get a visa for Nigerians to come to the United States. So it's this tit for tat that okay, it's hard for us to come to the U.S., so we're going to make it hard for you to go to Nigeria. Well, I was trying to point out to the guy, look, that hurts Nigeria far more than it hurts the United States. How many businessmen, how many investors have chosen not to send their money to Nigeria because they literally can't get a visa to go in because you make it so difficult? So that's like kicking your cat when you're having a fight with your wife. It's not the cat's fault, and it doesn't do any good with your wife either. But it also talks to the issue of we make it so difficult for people to get into our country legally. That guy was telling me that one of his people trying to come from Nigeria was having to wait without his passport until October to get his visa. That is absolutely ridiculous. So I completely agree that the U.S. visa application process is broken, it's messed up, it's wrong, it's unfriendly, it doesn't do any good for our country, and it certainly encourages more irregular migration, people coming into our country illegally. So we ought to pressure our representatives to do something about that so that people can more easily come to the United States and for legal purposes. All right. So thanks to all of you who are supporting the podcast. I've had so many people just send 50 or $100 to our PayPal and just tell me, look, use this to help people wherever you go next. And I want you to know that's exactly what I plan to do. So I hope you'll like and share the podcast wherever you find it. Leave us a review, please. It really helps with the rankings. And pretty soon, we're going to have a pretty great announcement about a new way that you can donate to the podcast where it will be tax deductible for you. So that's all for today. I'm Chuck Holton. This has been The Hot Zone. Thanks for watching.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.